Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final talk in this Commonwealth Heritage Forum webinar series on cemeteries and burial grounds across the Commonwealth. I'm Karen Taylor, a trustee of the forum, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for this evening, Harold Mytum, who will be talking about St John's Cemetery, Parramatta, the oldest surviving burial ground in mainland Australia. Harold is Professor of Archaeology at the University of Liverpool and past president of the Society for Post-Medieval Archaeology. His research interests include investigating identity and memory through mortuary evidence from not only Britain and Ireland, but also diaspora communities in North America and Australia. He has developed a memorial recording system that is being widely applied across the world. The format of this evening's webinar is that I will shortly hand over to Harold, who will talk for approximately 45 minutes. And then at the end, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions, but please do put questions into the chat function as we go along. Could I please just remind people to mute their microphones and turn off their cameras to help maintain bandwidth? I think that's everything in terms of arrangements, so I'll now hand over to Harold.
Thank you very much. And well, I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you today about the work that I've done at St John's Cemetery in Parramatta. This has involved survey, not excavation. I understand you've had some of the talks have been about excavation and others have been about conservation of memorials. Conservation is something I'm interested in, but I'm talking mainly today about the history of the cemetery and how it sits within the development of Parramatta itself. Often when we get into the cemetery, we're so excited by what we see there that we don't think about it as part of the wider landscape and how those people who are recorded there lived their lives and what the city was like at the time of their lives and their deaths. So we're just going to have a little bit of a look at that to see how the cemetery fits in to that wider picture, which helps explain why and how it developed the way it did. And this is also quite a substantial cemetery with over 700 memorials. So it's got a lot of evidence of the evolving Australian memorial culture, which starts off quite similar to that in Britain and Ireland, which isn't surprising, but does then develop its own particular characteristics, which is something that perhaps also happens elsewhere in the Commonwealth and would be a little interesting thing to consider, which I don't think has received much attention. Now, one of my main reasons for studying burial grounds and their memorials is that such locations combine elements of top-down planning and regulation, including locating the burial ground, laying it out, and any rules regarding its use, and individual or family choices about the memorials, their designs and their textual content, and may also involve decisions about where in the burial ground to be buried. Most memorials were erected after the person commemorated had died, but not all. Some were commissioned and in place before people died, so they could go and look at what they were going to be under. That's what's called a pre-need burial. So they're an interesting characteristic because you know then that if you know that's what happened, you know then that the deceased did choose what they've been given. But on the other hand, whoever is making those decisions is aware that what they have erected will be publicly visible and viewed by others and compared with other memorials in that and possibly other burial grounds. So these are private grief and loss on the one hand, but public statements on the other. And each of these memorials is made as an individual decision, which cumulatively creates the commemorative landscape we see today, which has some planning in the original design and layout and organisation and management, but has a lot of individual bottom-up decisions that unfold to create what we see. So that's why I think they're particularly interesting as a form of evidence of the past, because they have institutional government type aspects to them, but they also have those individual actors. Now, so let's give a little bit more context. Parramatta was established on the lands of the Parramatta people. As you can see, it's inland from Sydney, up the river, but not an incredibly long distance. And you can see the map of Australia and the small area that by 1815 is known and is at least explored and in places settled. But we're looking at a very small part of Australia, very much at the very beginning of the colonial history. Obviously not the history of people in Australia, but the history of the British settlement of it. Sydney was the original settlement. Well, it was at Botany Bay, and then they rapidly moved to Sydney, to Port Jackson, and developed the settlement there. But they were not able to grow crops very successfully in the area immediately around Sydney. So they started to explore other places nearby where agricultural settlements could be established. And one of these was at Rose Hill, which became so productive it expanded rapidly and was made the location of the town of Parramatta. The intention had been to have Sydney as a planned city, but the combination of the topography and the need for immediate building and infrastructural development meant that it was never fully achieved. In contrast, Parramatta was planned from the start in what James Semple Carr has termed a Baroque vista. But burial was not explicitly integrated into the ambitious designs for either Sydney or Parramatta, but had to be provided as best it could be. And some of the marks on the circles on those maps there indicate where the burial grounds, the early burial grounds, and then the later cemetery, the Devonish cemetery, were located. So they're on the edge of the town as the town gradually expands. So you start off having burials under near the rocks where the first settlements were, and then gradually burials move out in not very formal arrangements, and then formal arrangements are started, and then the burial ground at the old Sydney burial ground, and then the Devonshire Street Cemetery burial ground, one follow on from the other as the city expands and as they fill up. Sadly, both of those have been redeveloped, and so we don't have the memorials in any great numbers. A few have been moved to other cemeteries, but not in any great numbers and not in their original locations. So they provide some information, but they're far from ideal in terms of many of the things that one might like to study about the burial culture of the time. So here we see the river with Sydney on one side and Parramatta and the areas by 1798 that are being settled and farmed. You can see the spread of those around both sides of the river. And Parramatta becomes, for a time, the largest settlement in mainland Australia. And the first governor, Arthur Phillip, was responsible for the development of Parramatta in its planned format, together with Alt, who was the Surveyor General. So between them, they designed this layout, which we will see in the next slide. And then there's another phase of very important changes and developments at Parramatta, but also elsewhere across the colony by Macquarie later on in the early 19th century. So here we see a redrawing of a map of Parramatta, and then below a slightly later one in 1814. So this is an early map when we just see the High Street in lilac, the Governor's House in the turquoise circle, and the red box on the later plans is where the cemetery is, and this darker red circle here marks the barracks. So you can see you have the 2 points of authority at either end near enough of the High Street, and the properties either side with other parallel roads, and then one road developed at right angles and others beginning to be spread out either side. So this is an early version, and this is a really important diagram showing how it was all very neatly laid out, which in fact involved quite a lot of landscaping to fill in undulating land to make it as smooth in the High Street as it could be in the circumstance. And this is an interesting concept that I want to just develop during part of this talk, is the way in which this has the emphasis on improvement. This is an improvement ethic in terms of the layout of this settlement. And that's an interesting thing to see in a colonial context such as this. Most of the later 18th century improvement had an emphasis on land use, of manufacturing processes, but also of workers' physical conditions, their morals, and their practices. And this also applied to the criminal classes, with obviously convicts coming out of Australia as part of the new population from Britain coming to settle. And this forms one side of this balance between punishment and rehabilitation for those convicted, arguments that we have right to this day. And many people in Britain saw this as just a way of getting rid of people that they didn't really want in Britain, and some of the other places they've been sending them to elsewhere in the colonies had refused to accept anymore. So they were looking, Australia came up at just the right time as somewhere to take them, and also as a way of punishing them. But others saw this as an opportunity for them to be reformed. And there was quite a debate about this, and the two governors that I've mentioned were the two that really saw the opportunities for improvement, and indeed wanted to do that through the way in which they developed the colony itself. And of course, many of the people coming out, whether they were convicts or other people, were coming out to improve their positions and had that mentality of altering the world and enhancing their position, their understanding of the world, and their way in which they could operate within it. So this is the layout, but it's interesting that in the very first phase, there is no burial ground marked on these maps, but quite early on, it is established, as you can see, a little bit to the south of the main settlement. And increasing numbers of free settlers also provided more capital and expertise with the skills they were bringing, to mean that the population of Parramatta became more diverse and more entrepreneurial as time went on. So when they were in 1790, they already had 32 houses completed, and these were of a fairly standard design, 2 rooms, one with a fireplace and a brick chimney, but they're made of timber. They're made of they're quite ephemeral in one sense. They decay quite rapidly and involve a lot of maintenance. And they have meant to have 10 people in, but some of them had more because so many people were arriving. They weren't building the houses fast enough. And then it's notable that in a different street, they have unmarried women in a separate enclave in the settlement early on, and then a few families were together in huts. That suggests those houses might be very slightly different in terms of how they were being laid out. And of course, gradually more and more convicts were being released and allowed to do what they wished to do rather than what they were instructed to do. And archaeologically, we have evidence of these buildings. We have the maps, but we also now have the buildings which are pretty much spot on where they should be on the map. So the map is not just an idealized representation, but seems to be quite an accurate drawing up of the settlement, which is an important thing to know. And you can see that these buildings have the two rooms, and sometimes there are other buildings being constructed as well, which shows again that the group of people in these buildings are developing them themselves. And this is just a little bit of the archaeology from underneath building sites in Parramatta before they're redeveloped. And you can see at the top right there the foundations of the brick chimney. This idea of a timber building and a brick chimney is one you find in many colonial places, North America and so on. You find brick or stone chimneys. Obviously, the fire risk is then reduced, and the rest of the building may be timber. And thinking about the layout of that street and the way in which they have the regular houses and they're all spaced out with their own gardens and garden plots behind, then we can look at examples in Britain where this form of estate village starts in the 18th century and of course continues through the 19th. But it's remarkable how similar this early Parramatta settlement layout is. And the idea that this is not inspired by the improvement movement is difficult to argue with. So this is what should be 18, that's the wrong date, of course. In 1973, Parramatta didn't look anything like this. So you can see there that the main street down the middle there, but also these other buildings. There's the cross street, and there's yet more buildings like the hospital over there. So there's quite a complex of buildings laid out with these gardens behind in a landscape which is partially wooded and partly cleared for arable. So the church, the church is not built at the very beginning and then gets added into the plan where it was intended to be, but the burial ground was separate from the church, and that's quite unusual by the time that this is being this settlement is being laid out. In Britain, churchyards are still the normal location of burial around the church. Some of those get full, and then burial grounds are established linked to the church, but at a bit of a distance. I've just been involved with the excavations of one in Hull, which was constructed at about the same time as Parramatta was set up, in fact, because the one around the church in Hull was so overcrowded that it was no longer usable. But if you've got a new church, you would expect to have the burial around it. But that's not what they've done here. And again, this is a sign of improvement, because already there were pressures for burial to be reformed and not be in the middle of a settlement, but be on the edge. And so this is what we see here. We see the blocked out street pattern, and the burial ground is placed in a field that already exists, and presumably is no longer being used for arable, had cattle in it, and so it's easy to convert then to the town's cemetery. And as you see, the settlement gradually grows, and then the cemetery does become enclosed by the settlement. But it's not like that when it first gets set up, and that's something to remember. also true of many of the famous cemeteries everywhere else around the world, all across the Commonwealth, is that many of them are now surrounded by suburbs, but were originally set up on the edge of the cities, supposedly so that they could have fresh air and would be more healthy, but then actually become surrounded in due course. So there we are, there's another map showing it. So you can see how frequently it's being marked on the plans by this time, and now the settlement, you can see, has gone the other side of the river. And in fact, the Catholic burial ground, which gets established a little bit after in the 1820s, is up at the top part of this map here, beyond the area that's gridded up yet, but in the next stage of that same grid. So let's have a little look at the cemetery. Let's get back onto that. So there's Parramatta, surrounded on all sides now by development. This is a picture looking down into it, is from the multi-storey car park on the other side of the road. Very convenient for getting a really good view. And this is what it looks like on Google Maps. And in fact, we used Google Maps to create our stone by stone site plans. If you blow it up, as you can see in the top, on the top right hand side there, you can see all the curbs around the edge of the memorials that are still in place, and the actual headstones and so on themselves. And that provided a very useful base plan to complement my on the ground recording and study of memorials, which, as you can see, is split into 4 sections, which are important divisions in the layout of the cemetery, which you can see in the bottom right. So this shows the total number of monuments. The little lines are the headstones. I've marked the ledgers, which are flat slabs in yellow. The tombs, which are largely chest tombs or box tombs or altar tombs, they're all the same. The different places, different parts of the world call them different things. And pediment ones are more sort of square in plan, usually, and stick up higher, and they have urns or columns and things on the top of them. And you can see those are relatively rare, but the tombs and the headstones are particularly popular at Parramatta. So let's have a little look at what's going on. So Parramatta starts in the 1790s, and these are the memorials that we have in red. And these are when we think they're being erected. Other people may be recorded on some of these memorials at a later date, but that's when we think they go up. And you can see that only a few years we have the burial registers start from 1826, and you can see through to 1838 the sorts of numbers per year that we're having in the cemetery. So you can see we can be having hundreds in a year, but we may only have in a decade a relatively small number of monuments. So most people are not getting a monument, which of course is also true at this time in Britain, or certainly true until the middle of the 19th century in Britain. It varies from place to place in Britain after that, what the proportion is. But you can see that only a small number are. So there's a self-selection process here of people who can afford to have a memorial, and it's about them that we're talking when we're looking at the monument itself. So they're the people who've been successful in this colonial endeavour, and therefore perhaps not surprisingly have bought into and benefited from this improvement culture. And in the top right, you can see all the other cemeteries. So after the 1820s, numbers of burials start to decline relative to the population at St John's, because people are being buried elsewhere. The Catholics are going to St Patrick's. Earlier on, they're also in St John's. And then from the 1830s onwards, we get the Presbyterians, and we get another overflow Church of England one, and then we also get a Baptist one. So you can see that the options increase, and that's one of the reasons why the number of new memorials drops right by the 1890s, because there's lots of other places you might be buried, and here is probably being seen as full up, even though if you remember looking at that map, there seemed to be a lot of empty space. It's no doubt full of people. So here we see the earliest memorials and where they're located. You can see them all in one particular part of the burial ground. So it looks like that is the first part there. The ones at the bottom are rather confusingly in a similar color, but they're actually the tree, for some reason not been chosen for a different color on this plan. So these show that it's down in this area that on the northern part that the burials take place in the 18th century, quite restricted. And it may be that the cemetery was actually only marked off a small area at that time. But it looks like it's being spread over a reasonable area. You have some choices about where you can be buried. The really early ones are all on this western side, and then they seem to spread over to the east. So again, that may suggest it's filling up, and many of these blank areas around these earliest dots are full of all the other people who didn't have memorials. The earliest one is for Henry Edward Dodd, who was the superintendent of convicts, who died in January 1791. And his is the top left-hand corner memorial, two memorials that went up with people who died in 1791 and 1792. And this is a really important indication that people at Parramatta were sufficiently well organized. Remember, all in terms of thinking about burial and commemoration, even at this point, because remember, all the houses, apart from when they start building the governor's residence, which is in brick, everyone else is living in timber, but they have located stone sources and they are able to shape and carve and inscribe them. And the inscriptions on the earliest stones are remarkably competent. And the memorial shapes and styles are remarkably up to date for what's going on in Britain and Ireland. So there's no doubt in my mind that the people who are doing these carvings knew something about producing memorials already, whether they were people coming over who were just settlers or whether they were convicts. Somebody knew what they were doing to create these memorials in the very first few years of the settlement, already in a very competent manner. They're not elaborate, but they're not amateurish type memorials, which you do see sometimes in early grave markers around the world, that the first phase is done by people who are not au fait with producing memorials, and they have a certain sets of characteristics which these do not have. These would pass muster if they were in an Irish or English or Welsh or Scottish burial ground. And some of the shapes are distinctive for particular parts of Britain and Ireland, suggesting where people came from or where they knew about memorial forms. And you can see we have headstones, we have ledgers, and we also have tombs. So right from the very beginning, in the 18th century, we're having this variety of memorials being commissioned, produced, and erected. And I think that's quite an amazing thing. These must be some of the earliest surviving made in Australia artifacts of some scale that we have. I think it's quite interesting. I think people haven't really thought of them like that, but these are amongst the earliest things that are being produced. So many other categories of material culture in the earliest decades were still being shipped out from Britain or coming by India from wherever they were being traded to India. So the fact that these things are being locally made and to such a level of competence is important and interesting in itself. So let's have a little whirlwind through time. So if we move into the 1790s are still there in red, but you can now see what happens in the period up to 1811, and you can see how we're now beginning to see a bit more of a spread. You can see again we've got the same sort of mixture. We've got the bottom right, we've got quite an interesting style. Don't see this very often in Britain or Ireland, which is a very low base. It raises the top slab, which has the inscription off the ground, And it's not just a ledger slightly raised, it's more than that, but it's not like the one at the top left, which is a much more typical form that you'd see in an English churchyard. So that seems to be already developing as a local variant that actually becomes much more popular later on and is very distinctive. At the top right one is, I'm pretty sure, carved by an Irish carver. It's a Catholic memorial, and it has some very characteristic Irish style motifs on it. So that's again an interesting memorial that shows something about people's origins. You might be able to see in these pictures the quality of the lettering here, sacred to the memory of, and then the name, and the way in which the letters are done. Sacred is in a sort of complex Gothic style. Then there's a more simple Times New Roman type style lettering, but the name is in capitals. It's all done very much like you would see exactly back in the British Isles. This isn't people just cobbling something together. They're very well laid out. They're symmetrically laid out. We don't have any of the issues that we see when people are trying to grapple with the idea of what a memorial might be like. So we move on and we begin to see now the spread across the whole of the cemetery. So people are obviously able to be choosing where they're going. It's not like a modern cemetery where you just go in the next slot that comes available in a sort of carefully organized map. People are moving around, but there also seem to be hints of rows and lines of them, as you can see. So it clearly has some organization centrally, but at the same time, people could choose where they want to be in the cemetery, but perhaps along particular rough lines of graves. And you can see again some of them with very distinctive lettering. The top right one has a slightly curved top to it, so the water runs off it. This again is a very popular sort in Parramatta. You do get that in Britain, but its percentage in Parramatta is much higher than anything I've ever seen in Britain and Ireland. So that, and then gradually the cemetery just fills in more and more around there. We do have this one picture from the 1870s showing what the burial ground looked like, and it's before obviously a lot of the housing, some of the streets were beginning to be laid out, but there wasn't much housing around it yet. And that's the parsonage at the top of the hill there, which has now been demolished and rebuilt, been covered over with housing. But you can see that's looking down over the cemetery and indeed over the city itself. And you can see there that the cemetery is moderately well maintained. By this stage, it's got its brick wall around it, and you can see a range of monuments in there, many of them with chestnut paling fencing around them, or wooden fencing around them, and some with deliberate planting of trees on or near the graves, including some of these sort of coniferous type plants, which are the ones that you would expect to see in a British sort of cemetery. And others seem to have bushes, and then there are a few trees as well. So there's an interesting sort of mix of plantings in the cemetery, and also you can see it's quite full of quite substantial monuments, and even some of the headstones have got these railings around them. The bottom right picture shows some of the memorials sort of close up, and you can see some of them have cast iron railings around them, and some of them don't have anything. But some of the ones that don't have anything probably had those wooden palings around them when they were recently erected. So the visibility of the cemetery is not today, is not as it was developing. It's something for us to remember. It's maintained in its neat way through the use of people doing community service, having done various misdeeds and sentenced by the court for doing good things for Parramatta, and which includes trimming all the grass and maintaining it, which is why it looks as tidy as it does. There were paths laid out from the gate to create a sort of structure. There may have been more of these paths that have since disappeared, but some of them were visible with these brick-edged arrangements that you see there. And there we see a tourism group looking round the cemetery, being shown round by Dunn, who has also done a lot of research about the cemetery and whose inscriptions I've used heavily. She's a real expert on that. So here we see some of the memorials where people have been successful and have bought in to this improvement idea. And we see on the slope the way in which they've made a platform on the horizontal in order to have the iron railings round the tombs, the groups of tombs belonging to a family. You can see on the left there two identical memorials in the same plot, showing identity and cohesion of that family group. And these trees down the center of the cemetery are not the same as those on the photos. They're obviously a later planting to formalize along this route rather than original. Here we see some more of these memorials that have been painted up, have been conserved and painted up, and you can see the lettering better on these, and you can see how competent it is. We're into the 1830s with these particular ones. And we can see the range of styles of lettering and also the layout. And at the bottom, you can see some of the motifs that you can have on these memorials, which are very typical of the ones we see back in Britain. Gothic revival crosses and so on, a wreath in the center, and then flowers with broken stems on the right with a sort of dog tooth, nail decoration round the edge, a sort of Romanesque revival style memorial there for Eliza Folks on the bottom right. So the memorials are very much of types that we see in Britain for some considerable time, but some of them have their own little take. The shape of the ones at the top, these simple shapes, are again extremely common across Britain and Ireland at the time that they're going up in Australia. So we mustn't see Australia as lagging particularly. It's pretty much on message in terms of memorial styles. Clearly that information is coming out continually with new settlers, traders, and potentially with trade literature and guides and so on as well. So here we see some memorials though that include some of the ones that are rather more Australian or Parramattan anyway. That some of these are also seen in some of the cemeteries in Sydney. So I see this as a sort of New South Wales development, and they're sandstone memorials with very heavily relief decoration, and we don't have things like this really in Britain at the date that we're looking at with these, which is in the well within the 19th century. A lot of them are in false relief. You can see there's a sort of wood moulding there, and then it's cut back to make the urn or the flowers. And we get these in St John's, but we also, as the other cemeteries start to open, we get them also in the Catholic cemetery, but with Catholic iconography on them in the Catholic cemetery in Parramatta. So clearly they're being made by masons who are able to cater to different denominations. And the one on the bottom left is a hand holding a scroll on which the text goes. That's why it ripples. We do have hands and scrolls in Britain, but not with these elaborate forms of carving here. And same with the motifs. We have the motifs, but this is a local development. So quite rapidly, within the first few decades, Parramatta is developing its own culture, its own identity, its own ways of doing things. They're linked to what's happening back in Britain and Ireland in terms of the overall styles, these Gothic revivals and round-headed sort of more Romanesque type ones, classical revival ones, bottom left there. Those things are still being mimicked, but what they then do with that is completely of their own. So as the town develops, we get more and more of this mix of convicts then being freed, then we stop having convicts and we just have settlers. and the thing becomes much more of a mixed, vibrant community. So it's really the very earliest period when seeing what's going on with the convicts and how they're setting up an infrastructure that to me is the most interesting. But as we go on through history, we see the changes that go on. And here we see an overview. The number of memorials varies from decade to decade. This is showing the percentage within each decade. So that's why the columns are the same height. And we can see how headstones are always the most important, but how from the sort of 1820s onwards at St. John's, for these 3 decades, the tombs are extremely common. And there are, not insignificant numbers of ledgers and then also the pedestals. So the total number of non-headstones is extremely high. It's very significant. And this is far, far greater than we see in any British or Irish burial ground. In other words, the people who make it in Australia make it big enough to be able to have these monuments. They're not constrained by social conventions as to who can have a chest tomb. In many parts of Britain and Ireland, it wouldn't be possible for socially for some people who are perhaps affluent enough to have this type of monument. It wouldn't be seen as appropriate, but it is in Australia. And I think this is again part of what's showing a distinctive form of cultural material representation that's happening as this colony is becoming more and more confident, and of course as it becomes more and more interested in managing its own affairs, that you can see that there is this very substantial, successful and self-confident and self-advertising, of course, a group of families that are represented here. And here are indeed some of these tombs. Some of them are for single families under one. Some of them are sort of double size because you want to have it last for long enough, and you've got an extensive enough family, quite substantial. So we go from the governor with the only substantial house and the street with the scatter of houses, which looks very village-like, through to this urban development where the cemetery becomes part of a growing town to one where it really is very large. And we see this happening as well. I'll just finish with this one and one or two more, that we have excavations on some of these houses. We saw the convict buildings at the beginning, at the top of that left sequence, but here you see how it develops. Even in the convict area, it gets expanded. They're doing more things. They're making more space for the people in it. And then they gradually improve. And even by 1810, they're getting brick and sandstone footings for the whole house. They're building a veranda frontage. The whole thing is this is all part of this improvement, increasing affluence, increasing self-confidence, and doing things to their plots that are for themselves, not being part of a sort of convict or tenant relationship. So the memorials and their railings and the way in which they are demonstrating this confidence and success of this minority is really quite striking. And the convicts are shifted from having this more lax form of and flexible form of management to being corralled in the convict barracks by Macquarie in the 1820s, the women and the men, so that the town itself is sort of insulated from that component, and they're just managed as labourers, but they're kept at night in these barracks, so that the town is developing its own non-convict culture by the 1820s, which is what we're seeing with the houses developing, the cemetery memorials developing, the tradesmen's skills even and choices developing. That's all part, and this is again a different part of improvement culture. It goes very much with the sort of workhouse type of ideas that we see in Britain and Ireland. So I hope that's given you an idea of how these memorials give us, through the iconography, through the lettering, through the layout of the cemetery, and through their designs, what's going on. And I'll just finish, because I know this is being recorded, the article that I wrote about this, which is open access, is one that's given there. So when this goes up on the web, then you will be able to note that down. And also, if you're interested in how you might record and analyze burial grounds, then there's some links there to where you can get my advice materials about all that. And if any of you have any queries about any of that that don't get answered in the chat, do let me know. Just email me. I've got an unusual name. You should be able to find me very easily just by Googling me. And then you can ask me about doing anything. I'm very happy to advise and collaborate as best I can with anybody who's interested in doing that. So with that, I will come to an end and allow the questions, should there be any, to come forth. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Harold. That was absolutely fascinating as an insight into life and death in Parramatta from the late 18th century and through the 19th century. It's especially interesting to me, actually, as a heritage planner, to hear about the development of the settlement and how the position of cemeteries in relation to the settlement changed in those times. I think we can recognise a lot of that here, but over in Britain. But then, as you say, local traditions and customs started to develop very clearly. So that really was fascinating. Thank you. So over now to the participants. And if anyone has a question to ask Harold, could you please use the raise hand function? I can't see any raised hands at the moment, so if I could perhaps cheekily sneak a question in myself, Harold. I mentioned about my personal interest in settlement patterns and histories and modern day planning, and I'm curious as to what extent the setting of the cemetery has been respected by subsequent development, and whether the site and or the area have any conservation status at the moment in planning terms.
Yes, the cemetery does. I mean, there were one or two locals who were worried that I was there recording, thinking that I was recording it so it could then be built over. So clearly there are worries every so often about it, but I think it ought to be, well, it is protected. And I think there ought to be, should there be any threat to it, an enormous fuss, given that, you know, the best preserved, oldest cemetery that's left in Australia, if that's not going to, with first fleeters and all the rest of it in it, if that's not going to be preserved, then I don't think New South Wales is going to be interested in preserving much of its heritage at all. So I think in that sense, it's quite protected. I think there is probably more that can be done at a management level, thinking about it. So a number have been restored, memorials have been restored. In terms of what's around it, it's just completely built up with a lot of relatively recent development. So in that sense, its context has been lost. It's still on the same grid street pattern, but the sort of setting in terms of being able to look up the hill towards where the parsonage was and so on, that's all gone. But that's not an unusual situation in many parts of the world where the cemeteries were established, the later cemeteries were established. I think what's really interesting here, though, is that, and it's also true, by the way, around the later cemeteries I had on that slide that gave the list, they're all now surrounded. They were all on the edge when they were. So they've also been engulfed, just like all the big cemeteries in London or Liverpool or wherever have. But what's really interesting, I think, is that way in which right from the very beginning, and this is something that we see in a lot of places in Australia, is that the burial grounds are being kept separate from the churches, and that they are being managed up to a point by the secular authorities. They're then later taken over actually by the church. The church becomes established enough in Australia to demand that it becomes in charge of them. But when they start, they are being set up separately. And that tradition of this different location is something which is quite an interesting thing, that given how it wasn't happening in Britain in the 18th century. It was really only in the 19th century, the 1820s, really, that cemeteries started to be constructed independent of the church and in separate locations. The church might have had its own cemeteries which it carefully managed, which it had to have because the others were full, but they weren't, and those are quite rare. Overcrowding in cemeteries was definitely the norm until towards the middle of the 19th century. So this is an interesting way. Again, I think this is an improvement attitude. They don't want that problem of a really overcrowded burial ground around the church in the centre of the settlement. So they think right from the beginning to move it out.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions coming into the chat. So firstly from Lewis McCann, who is saying, the Google view shows a lot of grass. Did a lot of graves have no memorial at all?
Yes, most graves had no memorial. There may have been some memorials that have been cleared away, were too eroded, damaged, and in earlier management patterns than the one they have now, they might have been cleared away. But although some are eroded, most are not. So it's not like what's left has a sort of big spectrum, which suggests that a lot could have been so eroded they'd be even worse and would fall to pieces. It looks to me like an awful lot were not. And if you think about it, the sort of people who are arriving in Australia, and then an awful lot of them die within the first few years, they're not going to have the resources, or indeed necessarily have friends who are interested enough to erect a memorial. Unless you're already sufficiently rich that you're doing your pre-need memorial, you need some friends and associates to erect a monument for you. So I think in those early decades that's the case. Later on, perhaps slightly more people have them, but I still think the proportion is very low. It's difficult to know how to compare that with Britain. I've done some studies in West Wales, and I think that by the 1830s, 1840s, a very significant percentage of people, including agricultural labourers and small-scale tradesmen and so on, are erecting stones for their families. But then other studies, there's only been one other study, it's something we need to do more of, which has been done in Leicestershire, shows that a very tiny percentage of people have extant stones. So whether there have been some clearances of the stones in that area, or whether it was just not seen as what you did, is a question still open to debate. But certainly here, it looks like there was a very small proportion that had a memorial. But the ones that did often had quite up-to-date, competently made, so there must be people who are doing this as a trade, and also then quite a surprising proportion that are this more elaborate sort of monument.
Thank you. And Antonia Milan has her hand raised. Over to you, Antonia.
Thank you. I'm so curious about the denominational aspects here, because I mean one of the things that happened in Cape Town is that there was no freedom of religion until the 1780s. It was Dutch Reformed Church, and you were either a member or you weren't. And then there was freedom of religion, and then each church was then allocated a burial ground, not around the physical church, but a cemetery. And I'm really curious. So I don't quite understand. Did the Parramatta burial ground accommodate all denominations, or were there separate areas for
it was everybody to start with. Whether they were zoned, we don't have enough early stones and enough stones that indicate their denomination to be sure, because we only have that one Irish Catholic stone that definitely shows Catholic iconography. And it may be that a lot of the Catholics were not affluent enough. It may be that it was the the Anglicans, because of their connections, that actually were the ones that were affluent enough to have the monument. So that may be part of the skew. But there's pressure from the Catholics to have their own burial ground before they get their own in 1822. And then they establish it, and they probably establish it. There's a bit of discussion about this, but the common view seems to be that they establish it illegally at the very beginning, and then it's made legal after the event in the early 1820s. And then the other denominations seem to sort of come along later, whether that's because that's then there's enough of them to want their own burial ground, or they can afford one, or whether they were just quite happy being buried in the existing burial, in with all the other Protestants until that point. But these burial grounds are being set up separately. They're not all being done at one go by the authorities. By the time these other ones are being set up, the burial ground is being controlled by the Anglican Church by then, but they're obviously not able to stop the others setting up their own burial grounds. And they do actually have, each of them have their own typological distinctiveness. I haven't done a sort of detailed study of them, just having gone around and taken a lot of photographs and looked at them and looked at the inscription transcriptions and all the rest of it, I can see that each of them have their own mini cultural distinctions that are presumably at least in part related to their denomination, though may in part be related to where they've come from, where in the British Isles those denominations are most common, and that might be a factor, something I need to actually do a bit more work on.
I think that's a fascinating bit. Yep, thanks.
Thank you very much for that question, Antonia. We're nearly out of time now, so I shall draw this to a close, but not before thanking Harold very much indeed for a really interesting and insightful talk. Thank you to everyone else who has participated. Commonwealth Heritage Forum is starting to plan future series of webinars for next year. So before I hand over to Megan to close the webinar, I'd just like to wish everyone a happy Christmas and a very peaceful New Year. Thank you.